So, I'm Tom Fuller. Most of you know me in some capacity. I've been coming to the church off and on for 5 or 6 years. And Sarah and I started having some coffees, 6, 8 months ago. And the last time we met, which was in the spring, the first thing she said to me was, "You should come preach at Waverly." And I thought, wow, that's a lot of trust. Just putting that out there like that. So I thank you, Sarah, for your trust and encouragement and everything. Being 2018, I went out on Facebook and I said to my people, "I'm preaching at Waverly on Sunday." It's the first time I've done that. Even though my father is a pastor, and I grew up in the church. He preached for about 17 years total between 2 different churches down in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I said, this will be my first time preaching, and then a friend of mine from my high school youth group got back to me. He said, "Well, actually, you did preach back there in high school during Youth Sunday." So I'd forgotten about that, but it was good to be reminded because I guess I don't feel quite so strange up here. So once I said yes, I had to figure out what I was going to talk about, and I really went through a lot of permutations of that over this summer. But interestingly enough, what started to come in for me was wanting to engage more closely with my ancestors. And I don't know if Sarah just planned this out, that this talk about ancestors would be like right before All Saints Day, but it's pretty good serendipity. For many years, for decades, I would say I've related to my spiritual ancestors, Jesus and Buddha, and I've claimed Martin Luther King and Gandhi. But I wasn't so excited about my blood ancestors. I had kind of a thing about those people. My family goes back to 1630 on both my mother's and my father's side. Actually, my father's side came over on the Mayflower. So I had 2 Fullers, Samuel and Edward Fuller, and their wives, and Samuel Jr. were all on the Mayflower. So, that's something to be proud of, right? Right here at the founding of this country. And I knew a lot about it during my youth because, it's passed down through family stories. This was something that the family was proud of. But I, starting in my late teens and early 20s, I wasn't very proud of them. Part of what was going on for me was, I grew up in Berkeley in the 60s and 70s, and we had these waves of feminism that were coming through and the civil rights movement, and there was a wave back then that's a little bit similar to what's going on right now, in that it's kind of the white man's fault for all of these problems that are going on. And I was a sensitive young man, and I think that kind of went in and wounded my heart a little bit. I don't know if I talked about it to anybody, but I think that went in, and since my ancestors were so connected to the church, and there was a bunch of white men there that were doing all kinds of things in this country back in the beginning, I decided I wasn't going to be too proud of my ancestors. So that was a big factor, and that went on for a number of decades, where I was just kind of like, yeah, my ancestors are great, we'd sit around campfires at various times and we'd call in our ancestors or whatnot, but I never had really great things to say about them. So part of that also was that in addition to being there in 1630, they came in on the Puritan waves that came over from England. And you know, part of that, what was interesting about that is that they were escaping persecution themselves with the whole separatist movement that was going on with the Church of England. And so that was a part of what was going on for my ancestors. And they settled in Massachusetts Bay Colony, one in a town called Dedham, Mass, outside of Boston, and the other in Salem, Massachusetts. And so this is on my father's mother's side, the Hutchinsons. We traced their line back to the very beginning of Salem, before it was called Salem, back in like the late 1620s. But they were there also during the witch trials. So it's like, I never was really clear, well, let's see, were my people accusing people of witchcraft? Were they being hung as witches? I didn't really want to get that close to it, you know, it kind of freaked me out. But I knew that I had ancestors that were there at Salem, and so it was another thing. I don't want to think about this too much. But I knew about it. And then more recently, you know, I got involved in doing a lot of white privilege work a year and a half ago, and I did a lot of reading, and one of the books that I read was about the New England slave trade, and so I was like, oh yeah, we were probably involved in that too. So, you know, it's really interesting that in a certain way, I think all of these factors have conspired to maybe have me take my own kind of inquiry into white privilege, male privilege, a little bit deeper. Maybe, I don't know. But it really hit me very hard, and I studied a lot, went to some of the seminars. That's actually where Sarah and I met. One of the things that I heard about last spring was that there was going to be a man talking. He was actually not talking about white privilege per se, it was about sacred masculinity. It was Lama Rod Owens from a Buddhist center in New York City. And Rod is a very unusual Lama. To be a Lama, it's a Tibetan term for guru or precious teacher. And to be a Lama, you have to do a 3 or 3 month retreat. It's very, very intense. So he did that, and he's got quite a story to tell about what kind of transformations went through that for him. And he's really engaged in doing a lot of social work and social justice work, and bringing social justice issues into the American Buddhist community. Because I've been in the American Buddhist community for 30 years, and you know, we never talked about slavery or white privilege or male privilege or any of these things. You know, we were trying to get enlightened. So, you know, it's a beautiful thing what he's doing, and part of what he's doing is kind of reminding people that, well, you know, social justice has to be a part of this conversation, and that, you know, if we're gonna all get free, if we're all gonna wake up, we all need to wake up together. So anyway, I went and saw Lama Owens last spring, and we had a little exchange. I asked him a question, and I don't remember even what my question was, but part of what came out of that exchange was he said, you should get to know your ancestors better. He said, get to know your ancestors better and take some pride in your ancestors, and then you'll have better ground on to talk to me about my ancestors. And I was like, whoa, that really, really touched me. It penetrated. Because, you know, this is all part of the conversation about slavery, and, you know, these ancestors are, in some senses, you might say, you know, the descendants of slave owners talking to the descendants of slaves. And So with that exhortation, I said, okay, well, I'm going to get to know my ancestors better. And the really amazing thing was that my sister, who lives in Portland, had our family lineages, like in a book, in her closet. And on both sides, my family is traced back from this generation to 1620 and 1630. All the way back to the Mayflower, and on my father's side, 5 generations before that. So I've been spending time kind of immersing myself in these people. And so it was, as I'm doing that, and I'm actually, also there's been some books that I've found that have talked about specific ancestors. And as I've been able to start to relate to specific individuals, I'm finding that judgmentalism is melting away, you know, and that embarrassment about being this guy who's been a WASP for 400 years going on, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, for those of you who don't know that term. But one of the ancestors that I found was a guy named Thomas Fuller, who was born on January 20, 1619, and I was born on January 20, 1956. So I was like, all right, what's going on here? You know, are you talking to me, or am I talking to you? Or, you know, there's something going on here. So this coming January, he'll be 400 years old. So Thomas was actually a cousin of Edward and Samuel, who came over on the Mayflower, and he came over in 1635 when he was 16 years old. I don't know how much he was about the religion and the fleeing persecution, or if he was just kind of bored in this little town where all the land was used up and there wasn't any good jobs, and he'd been getting letters from his cousins, and it's like, come out here, you know, there's lots of land, there's a lot of stuff to do out here. So he came out here then, and he said, as I said, helped form the town of Dedham, Massachusetts, which was founded in 1636. They received a grant from the colonial governor for 200 square miles south and west of Boston. And so that's all really great, right? But guess who was living in that land before these guys came, right? So there were native people there, and you know, this was one of the other things that I didn't want to think about my ancestors, right? Because, you know, we were involved in that beginning of the whole genocide that went on with indigenous Americans. But again, as I looked closer and I read about this, I saw that what happened was that in that first wave, they really tried to work with the native people, and they had treaties, and it sounds like they kept those treaties. They worked together for mutual protection and so on for about 50 years. And then it just got too crowded, more people came in, they weren't interested in the original treaties or the original more religious ideals of these Puritans, and they were just, you know, about taking the land. So there was one major war, King Philip's War, Metacon. Philip was a name that he actually took because he'd been so close with the colonists. But he led a big uprising against the colonists as they were moving in and taking more and more of the land. And it was a terrible war. It went on from 1675 to 1678. And most of the colonial villages were decimated during that war. And I've heard about 3,000 native fighters were killed. But, I had a Captain Matthew Fuller, who was part of that fighting on the side of militias, because all the communities had militias back then. So, you know, this is again part of the really sad history of this country. So that was going on, and then there's one other particular ancestor that I want to tell you about, who I found out about, and his name was, I'm going to call him Jeremiah Fuller. And he lived in Salem in 1692, which is when all the witch trials are going on. And one of the things I read about Jeremiah Fuller was that he kept a lantern in his window and a fresh horse in order to help anybody who'd been accused of witchcraft to get out of town. And I was like, wow, I'd never known that about my ancestor. And this said so much to me also just about what was going on in Salem, because I didn't read a whole lot about it. I gradually in bits, what was really going on there. And if you can imagine, there's this town that kind of goes crazy, and then people are being accused, and you have to defend yourself, and you're having to run away, trying to be safe. But all in all, there were 20 people that were hung in that situation. And it was a terrible situation. But learning about Jeremiah Fuller, I realized, well, there were some people there that were trying to keep cool heads and trying to keep the peace, and maybe trying to think in a more open way, in a creative way, just how do we survive? You can't leave. There's nowhere to go, really. This is your community. But what we can do, well, we can, help people get away. Kind of reminds me of the modern sanctuary movement, doesn't it? In certain ways. Just trying to help some of our brothers and sisters who are being unjustly accused. So anyway, that was fabulous to learn about that. So part of what I'm starting to take away as I'm looking at the ancestors a little bit more deeply is that I've dealt with a little bit of embarrassment about the fact that I didn't think about them for 40 years. I just had this judgment, and I had them set and locked into that, and it's like that's who they were, and I wasn't proud of them. I was not proud of them, and even though they helped found this great country of ours. So part of my takeaway from that is that we need to look below the surface. And when we do that, we start to see that there are individuals, there are people that are dealing with whatever kind of challenges and struggles they're dealing with, and then they respond out of that based on whatever's going on for their times. And I find that it's really interesting that it took me so long to come back around. Part of the reason it did take me so long was that I had a lot of healing to do from that time in the religious cult. Now, a lot of you people were there when I talked about my time in the Moonies 4 years ago. That was a big healing for me too. But when I gave that talk, I went into a religious cult right out of high school. I was out seeking God's will for my life, and so it kind of locked in this kind of whole idea of like, oh, I don't like Christianity. That's where it got me. And I definitely don't like my ancestors because they were all those white Christian people. So I think I had to do all that healing around that trauma that I experienced going into that religious cult before I could start to unpack some of this stuff and start to, reapproach the church in a certain kind of way and reapproach my ancestors. But I see a lot of mystery in that as well. There's a lot of kind of really interesting things about how it is that I got to this church and how it is that I made it to the white privilege talks, and I got to Rod Owens, and he said, study your ancestors, and this has been so much of a blessing for me. It's been so deep, and I feel like out of doing it, my view of my life is so enhanced. I feel like I've got this sense of my life going back 400 years, and then it doesn't end here. I've got children, who are moving forward. And so there's this very interesting thing about, well, what is it like to be at the center of life, where we've got these ancestors and we've got this life going forward. And it's very empowering to me, actually, and it's teaching me a lot. So I want to say that I feel like I'm just at the beginning of the work of getting to know my ancestors. And we live in difficult and dynamic times, and as circumstances now conspire to bring the shadows of racism, sexism, and white supremacy out into the open for us to deal with on an individual and collective level, I have few answers on how to deal with that, the collective sins of my people in this nation, other than to become aware of them, to try to understand the forces that went into creating them. And I feel like my ancestors can help me in this. I feel like all of our ancestors can help us. And partially that's through understanding that they've been through some similar times. You know, I gave these examples, you know, of the Salem witch trials, of these wars, you know, and we've all got that in our background. So, you know, it might be possible to tune into them and ask them for guidance, you know. And the other thing is through kind of starting to open up to the ancestors, and I don't mean this solely on a historical kind of intellectual level, like I'm reading about my ancestors, but also on a spiritual level. It's kind of like what we're doing here today and next week during Dia de los Muertos. It's like, you know, the traditions say that during this time the veil is thin, and that we can contact our ancestors, and that if we reach out to them, they'll reach back to us, and they'll give us support and guidance. And so this is one other way that I think that our ancestors can help us if we can, you know, when we're praying, you know, pray to Jesus, pray to Buddha, but also, you know, I'm starting to pray to my ancestors, like, how do we get through this time? This terrible, crazy time that's so polarized, and there's so much violence, and there's so much hatred, and there's just so much disillusionment and discouragement and fear. Can there be some kind of support for that? And so that's kind of where I've gotten to in my exploration and in my study. I feel like I'm just beginning it, really. I mean, I've got all these resources, and I've just been kind of digging into it for a couple of months. But this is one of my takeaways for it. So I think that's all I need to say about this right now. I really appreciate your attention and an opportunity to say these things and to explore these things. And again, I thank you for kind of lighting a fire under me to get with the ancestors in a whole different kind of way. And I hope that you know, all of our ancestors may bless all of us, both personally in our lives and also in these greater issues that we're all dealing with in this time.